At Judson Bates 1359 asks, with the Horus Heresy storyline coming to a close and the Scouring coming, I wouldn't mind seeing videos on the Shattered Legions. Obviously Iron Hands, Raven Guard and Salamanders didn't play a huge role in the Horus Heresy, but what about the Scouring? Now this is a fantastic question. The Scouring is supposedly the next series coming, as the last Siege of Terror book, The End in the Death Volume 3, has been complete, and particularly with the Shattered Legions, we don't quite know what they're going or what direction they seem to be taking them, but the events of the Scouring itself will have so many smaller and bigger events to cover that perhaps we can sort of answer that question in a general timeline of big things so far in the lore that we've seen that they will have to cover in the events of this Scouring series. Now of note, the first thing that the Scouring should be covering, or hopefully should be covering, is the Lion, Leman Russ and Corvus Corax's reunion on the world of Deliverance, which is Corax's homeworld, and this would be after the events of the Siege of Terror and the Battle of Yarant, I believe it is called. Now, the Battle of Yarant was where Abaddon had cornered the Space Wolves following the terrible massacre against Horus's Sons of Horus, just immediately after Moloch when Horus ascended. Corvus Corax and his Raven Guard essentially went in and managed to try and save the Space Wolves. And this is where the Space Wolves, Leman Russ, Corvus Corax and the Raven Guard had been essentially when the Siege of Terror was entering its final moments, and the Lion himself has been travelling around blowing up traitor homeworlds, and there should be a reunion, a sort of tenuous reunion between Russ and the Lion, where they'll finally meet, and they will probably head on to Terror itself. Obviously, hopefully we'll get some really fantastic dialogue between these two brothers that have had numerous confrontations and a sort of troubled relationship, and then we'll find out their reaction when they discover what's really happened on Terror in their absence. The next big thing, hopefully we will soon be hearing about, probably the most important thing, will be the cleanup of the Siege of Terror itself. Terror, as we've hit, spoiler warning as going forward, there will be spoilers for the End of the Death Volume 3, so if you don't want to hear those, obviously try and avoid them after this. Terror itself is in a very precarious position because precarious is not even the right word. It's essentially been melded with the warp in some places. The warp is spilled over, it's ruined, it's created now it's called the City of Dust, which is playing on the King in Yellow storyline, and demons been running rampant. Loads like the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, the White Scars, they are sort of holding the last line, the last bastion, whilst the Emperor has been put upon the Golden Throne as the Corpse Emperor himself. Essentially, what will have to be now is that now that Horus has been slain and the traitors defeated, and they are evacuating as the Great Scouring, the scouring of the traitors from the galaxy begins, Terror itself needs to be cleansed. There's barely anyone still left alive after this galaxy-defining war, and there's even talk about when, even in some books, about how when the Space Wolves and Dark Angels arrive, there's essentially many of them are running through the halls of Terror, essentially just slaying demons and echoes of the previous battles, and hopefully we'll have to see some of that cleanup first, because, you know, the palace is not in good shape. And we will also have to see the Primarchs arrive. Guilliman himself, as we've seen during the last few Siege of Terror books, has been trying to get that signal through that, you know, he is so close, and unfortunately Guilliman will arrive late. We'll have to see how, you know, the avenging son fails to avenge his father, or maybe later, perhaps in the Scouring, he will earn that epithet, he will earn that title, and we'll have to see the reactions of all the other Primarchs. Jagatai Khan, my man, who fought Mortarion, did not go down, so we'll have to see how upon his sort of saving and resurrection of a kind from Malcador, or the stasis pod he was put in by Malcador, Jagatai Khan will have to awaken to an Imperium that's changed as well, and we'll have to see all the Primarchs who are still living, all their reactions to how Terra had almost fallen. The next huge piece of lore which we'll see, in fact it's something that even as Warhammer fans, some of the older fans will probably know, it's one of the few things that has sort of been around longer than almost some of the Horus Heresy lore itself, which is the formation of the Codex Astartes. Guilliman is going to form his sort of, his dictionary, his sort of code of war for the Imperium. It will split all of the legions into chapters, 1,000-man chapters that will spread across the galaxy, so that no one individual could wield such power again like Horus did. No Primarch such as Horus could, or even any of them, be corrupted to the level where they could have so much influence over the Imperium. And this will be the formation of many of our chapters and successor chapters. This will be the second founding, and it's not going to go down well with so many of the other Primarchs, such as, I don't think any of the Primarchs are in favour, particularly Dawn was known, and even Vulcan. Like, none of them were just happy with the splitting of what was left of their sons. But to avoid the next sort of crisis and avoid war between themselves, they all eventually do agree to the Codex Astartes, and we'll have to see how that is affected on the Marines level as well, how all these warriors who had fought side by side with each other during the heresy, they will then be split off. But how many of them probably enjoy this is a great part to the question of the scattered legions, because particularly with the Iron Hands themselves, they've been broken apart so much, and we'll see how, like, the Red Talons, some of them have embraced parts of their Primarch which are the unsavory bits, and some of them have remained true. Some of them have even embraced heretical technology, such as with the Hellfathers, when they turned the keys of hell in the Scattered Legion short story, where some of them literally become mindless automatons as sort of like almost like servitor super soldier space marines. So there'll be some exploration into how those are split up into their own chapters. And my poor man's the Salamanders, who are currently sitting over at Nocturne, not really aware of the resurrection of their Primarch, I think, to my knowledge. So the Salamanders themselves, although Vulcan himself luckily asked not to be split, so they will not be affected by the Codex Astartes too much, obviously with the Promethean Creed, so they have their own rules. But this will be a massive point in the lore which we'll see the Imperium sort of change on an axis. Another thing we have to encounter in this Scouring series will be the Calibanite Civil War, / when Lionel Johnson returns to Caliban following the destruction of the Traitor Primarch's homeworld and obviously visiting Terra. The Lion will return to the place where he thinks is home, and then he will be fired upon by Luther, his once adoptive father. Hopefully we'll actually get to see the Battle of Caliban itself. It's always been something described within the lore, and we just see the power up of Luther being infected by chaos energy himself, delving too far into the mysteries of the Knights of Lupus library, which is on Caliban. Hopefully we'll see Cypher or Zahariel or Cypher or Corswain. I know Sam Manetero will have some things to say about who he thinks Cypher is. Maybe there'll be some massive hints in this, sort of covering that part of the lore. Potentially the massive, obviously with the Lion's return now, so many of these fallen that we will encounter in the modern timeline, these will be members present upon the destruction of Caliban, so hopefully we'll get to see some, particularly with the Dark Angel stuff, we'll see some coverage there, and we'll get some characters that will then be brought back into the 40th millennium. We will then also see a big event, and I feel I'm sorry for shout out to Chapter Master Valrak for this big L that's going to happen here for the Imperial Fist, which is the Iron Cage. In lore, the Iron Cage is where the Imperial Fists, Dawn has been destroyed emotionally and mentally by the Siege of Terror. He was almost tempted by corner in some of the books, which was really interesting to see. And he's sort of become self-flagellating about how much he has failed the Imperium and his father. And upon the anvil that is this, his greatest rival, Perturabo, like this figure who his brother who they'd fought against in the Siege of Terra, trying to one-up each other and play tricks, on the first war book. We'll have to see how Dawn wants to break his Imperial Fist upon this anvil to cleanse themselves of this shame and to purge any weakness within them, so he will throw the Imperial Fist into this well-fortified place of the Iron Warriors, and they will duke it out. And then it's a massive point in the Imperial Fist lore where so many of them do die in this horrific siege that goes on, and then eventually Gilman will come to the aid, but we'll have to see this in person. Maybe in the lore it's kind of been so far described as just essentially a massive L for the Imperial Fists. It almost seems like it doesn't make all the genius of Dawn sort of evaporates, and hopefully we'll get a more nuanced and balanced take where it's more of a there's something that Perturabo exploits a weakness within Dawn. Maybe it's a bit more of an even feel, but eventually the Imperial Fist will come out of this and then be broken up into their specific chapters. Another notable event will be the destruction of the traitor homeworlds. I do believe that some of these will probably be off-screen, such as Chemos for Fulgrim, maybe even Colchis for Lorgar, but there are some events that have been described as much larger, such as there has been described as the Siege of Olympia, which is the homeworld of Perturabo and his Iron Warriors. Of course, Iron Warriors, as much as they break down fortifications, they can certainly build them, and it could be a great opportunity for where, particularly again, some of the more smaller members, so much more like an Astartes battle rather than Primarchs being involved, and hopefully some of the other homeworlds of the traitor Primarchs, they will also make a great feature in this time, because it's such a great opportunity again for like more of the smaller characters to sort of have their interactions, and perhaps even introducing, a lot of our main characters, our main big heavy hitters, they've died in this massive Siege of Terra or in the events of the Horus Heresy, and we obviously need new characters, or perhaps characters that become existing leaders of warbands later on in the 4th millennium. They need to make a rise at this time now that all of the, the Mournival, so many of them are gone, so many of the leaders of the other traitor legions, they've all been killed. Another event that we are hoping to cover in the Scouring series will be the Vulcan hunting Fabius Bile, which is an event that is assumed to have taken place. Now, Fabius Bile himself, the apothecary, the flayer, the absolute disgusting man that he is, he was not present at the Siege of Terra with the rest of the Emperor's children, and so he's sort of been off on his own journey, and he's described as leaving with a portion of the Emperor's children forces, or perhaps apothecaries of other legions too, and his experiments and obviously his genius is something that cannot be allowed to exist. Obviously, we, spoilers, know exactly that he does survive, but it's described that Vulcan himself will go on the hunt for him. This perhaps may involve some of the salamanders who still exist within the post-Siege of Terra, as obviously the salamanders, it's an opportunity for them to go on a quest, following their Primarch who still lives, thank God, Vulcan stomp stomp. There's also another opportunity, as it was mentioned within the Thousand Suns books, for some Salamanders characters, which was the Salamanders who have followed Vulcan since his resurrection. These joined up with some of these Space Wolves who have been part of the Horus Heresy books, such as in the Crimson King and the Fury of Magnus, which is, I believe it's Bialki, and unfortunately his Space Wolf characters are no longer, his brothers are no longer with him, but him and two of the other Salamanders characters who escaped my memory for the moment, they were approached by Garviel Loken and Nathaniel Garrow during the Siege of Terra, after the events of the Fury of Magnus, and they weren't obviously members who have joined the Inquisition. They weren't members of the Knights Errant, but they perhaps have a role as they've mostly been following the Thousand Sons. They were involved in the Thousand Sons storyline, and perhaps like Ahriman and loads of other characters who are now essentially the Thousand Sons. This is a gap between where Thousand Sons are now sort of in the camp of they are they no longer have a place in the Imperium. There's no access for them to find redemption. They were condemned by the Emperor to Magnus, and so hopefully, particularly with characters like Ahriman or Aemon, there's a part between him now and what will be eventually the rubric of Ahriman. Perhaps we'll even see the beginning of that sort of process for Ahriman, where he will start to go, now's the time I need to use the Book of Magnus. And hopefully these characters such as these salamanders and the space wolves who were around in these books, be a great time for that interaction and sort of continue that along that plot line. Another part of the lore that is stated to have happened is the Cadian sector itself is quote-unquote liberated or freed. Of course, Cadia is a massively important world within the Warhammer storyline. Before Cadia ever became the Cadia, it was where Lorgar himself was first sort of introduced to the primordial truth, where he met the demon Ingethel, or even saw the ascension of the demon Ingethel. It's where he stated that all he ever wanted was the truth. The Cadian sector at this time is very much situated as it always has been, which is next to the Eye of Terror. And perhaps this might be quite late within the Scouring series, because the traitors need to essentially be pushed all the way back from what was essentially, just around the Sol system itself, all the way to what is the far, I think it's either the eastern fringes of the galaxy, but it's, almost the other side of the galaxy. So the traitors have a long way to go before being all pushed into the warp and / the Eye of Terror. It'd be interesting to see particularly the Cadian sector here, because this world itself, although purged by Lorgar after the knowledge was gained of chaos from it, Cadia itself might sort of be a stronghold, particularly for the word bearers. So it might be the point at which we see Lorgar himself, who's not yet ascended to a demon prince, he might be pushed back into the Eye of Terror from here, and we need to still see a little bit of Lorgar. Lorgar himself is described in the End and the Death as having sort of continuing primitive rituals on distant worlds, and again, maybe perhaps Lorgar's got a role to play in sort of being the last of the traitor legions to be pushed out. I do believe the Sons of Horus and many others sort of almost flee after the death of their Primarch, so it'd be nice to see a bit more of the other legions that sort of haven't been in the spotlight, particularly in the last few novels. They sort of now are sort of taking the reins, and they get to have more interactions, and then they'll be the final sort of disgraceful push out of the traitor line. Another event we are hoping to see will also be Rebute Guilliman and the Alpha Legion / Alfaris Omegon confrontation. It has been stated in the lore that Alfarius did in fact die on Pluto to Rogel Dawn. It's very much considered fact, but as many of us, this obviously could be a lie, but the true lie is that there is two Primarchs, Alfarius and Omegon, and when Alfarius does die, Omegon essentially assumes the permanent mantle of Alfarius Omegon, the one singular Primarch. In this battle between the Ultramarine, or the remnants of the Ultramarines, and the Alpha Legion, essentially Guilliman makes a move that's completely out of his ordinary scope, and he makes an attack for the head. He tries to cut off the head of the Hydra, and though supposedly he is in a confrontation where he kills a Primarch, he cuts off and essentially cuts down another brother, another Primarch dies. The Alpha Legion themselves don't seem to react in the way in which other legions would. After the death of Horus, the entire Sons of Horus are basically going to crumble, collapse. It almost seems like it's completely all over and not worth it. But the Alpha Legion, they don't seem to react at all, and they actually keep fighting the Ultramarines. And what's interesting enough is that though supposedly this Alfarius dies in this confrontation, or this Omegon dies in this confrontation, the Alpha Legion have not reacted, and they actually go on to win the battle against the Ultramarine. So Guilliman himself, despite it being a Primarch, and the Alpha Legion missing now a Primarch, they managed to sort of, maybe not outwit, but tactically defeat a Primarch in battle. So that'll be a very interesting confrontation to see, and possibly it might be the start of the rumours about how it's not really Omegon who dies in this. Obviously we've seen parts of the lore where Omegon has given a portion of his blood to another Space Marine, and in a way they get like a sort of power up and a temporary boost, and they can actually be perceived as a Primarch by even the other Alpha Legion members. So this may sort of be the disappearance of the Primarch Omegon. The next thing we are hoping to see will be a smaller piece of the lore, but it might be something bigger, I do believe, which is the Nostromo Sector Purge. Now, the significance of this is obviously this will be not quite with Conrad Kurz, who's supposedly at this point in like a little stasis chamber being kicked out by Sanguinius in the book Ruinstorm, just set afloat, and that will be happening many years after the Siege of Terra. But this is described as the devastation of the Nostromo sector, and obviously Nostromo sector, Nostromo, the world of the home of the 8th Legion, the 9th Lords, will maybe much like the Thramas Crusade, this might sort of be a decimating or some parts of their numbers. And it's described in this conflict that there's a fight between possibly the 8th Legion and members of like the Ultramarines and the Blood Angels, but also there's an element of what they do believe will be the Ashen Claw. It's described as Marines who wear older pattern plate but have markings that no one seems to recognize. And this may lead into something incredibly cool, which is something I have theorized check out my other video, which is where is Sevatar, because I believe this is actually where Sevatar might enter the play. And it's described as this is where this sort of mystery legion are responsible for this Nostraman sector purge. And if anyone sort of knows their lore around who the Ashen Claws and the Kakaradons are, I believe that they may find their founding within this sort of time. It's theorized that these two maybe one or two of them, or possibly neither, but I do believe it's either one of them or most likely both. They found their origins in this time from an offshoot of the Raven Guard, who were sent sort of away or dismissed with dishonor by Corvus Corax during the Great Crusade. These were the members who were sort of used by Horus as sort of their own, his own personal ragtag force. They were the members of the Legion who Corax didn't really like, and because he believed them to be like brutish overlords, kind of like how the prison guards were of his homeworld. I think it might be a great opportunity for where Sevatar might enter the role as sort of this, he might join up with this ragtag sort of group here. He's known to even have some members of the Raven Guard who were sort of loyal members to him, so it might be a great opportunity to bring in Sevatar and then almost have him act like this third force who's, in a way, it's called the Nostraman Sector Purge because perhaps members of the Traitors and the Loyalists sort of, post Siege of Terror, perhaps the Loyalists had, in a way, they've sort of been ruined and corrupted in the sense that they've become mindlessly, brutish soldiers, and they don't care for the common civilians. And then also the Traitors themselves, not much has to be said about their methods of war. And maybe Sevatar might enter into this fray as a sort of, an extra third degree, an extra ingredient that sort of purges and attacks both of these forces, and it goes on that journey exploring his character arc. It may not happen, but it could be a great opportunity to place him in there, and obviously to see then the origins of this Ashen Claws and Kakaradons, who, well, mostly the Ashen Claws who get founded within this time, or they're the ones responsible for this purge, but also the great ancient pact between the Kakaradons and the Ashen Claws, said to be forged in, a time before than anyone can remember. Perhaps it's something where they both originate from the same thing, or the same force led by a mysterious figure who might be their sort of forgotten one in their ancient myths. And perhaps the last event, although I don't suspect that we may see this, hopefully there'll be some events that we haven't even thought of that will come up in the Scouring, but what might end the Scouring series will actually hopefully be the first Black Crusade. Now, the first Black Crusade, some of the events are written into some novels, which is the death of Sigismund at the hands of Abaddon, which, you know, a great, glorious last stand of Sigismund, who almost manages to kill Abaddon apart from his plot armor, and his corpse, you know, with the great respect the traitors had for Sigismund, they send off his corpse and his black sword, you know, etched with "We have returned." I can't remember the exact phrase. And this is essentially the Black Legion has been formed by Abaddon and his members, and it'll be great to see the actual first Black Crusaders and the end of sort of where the traitors were pushed back into the Eye of Terror. The Great Scouring is ended because now the traitors are on the attack, and they're no longer running. The first Black Crusade is obviously where we lose Rogel Dawn. Rogel Dawn, obviously the only thing that remains of him is his sort of severed wrist or severed, you know, hand, his gauntlet, you know, an imperial fist is left behind, you know. It's a great inside joke there, and it'd be fantastic to see this sort of element brought into play where, you know, a Primarch goes missing. And this leads on perhaps the last event that has to be covered, although it may be covered in some of the ones we have said since the beginning, which is the disappearance of the Primarchs themselves. You know, many of them, particularly Corvus Corax, who sort of immediately after he finds out that the Emperor is wounded, he shuts himself in a tower, and after a year he will leave into the warp shouting, you know, "Nevermore," as a reference to his inspirations of Edgar Allan Poe. Leman Russ will famously have his great feast where he will see something else in the room with him, and then most of his first company, all apart from Bjorn, Bjorn will have to stay, the Fell Hand, and Russ will enter into the Eye of Terror as well. Also, we will see the disappearance of, perhaps, obviously, it will have to be here, which is the destruction of Caliban, which will be the lion being sealed away, or perhaps answer the question of how he ended up into that forest realm, which we've currently seen in modern lore. We will also see the Khan ride off and chasing off the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, into the Webway, or perhaps into the Dark City of Comora, and that will be an answer to perhaps the explanation of those events, and we've seen a bit more clearly in novel form. We have seen in novel form so far Guilliman in the Dark Imperium trilogy, where Guilliman obviously gets wounded by Fulgrim, so that one will perhaps, you know, that one's already sort of taken place, and obviously Dawn will be lost to the Black Crusade. And I do believe that will be the sort of main one that they have to cover in the Scouring. Hopefully, again, as I said earlier, we'll see lots of like smaller ones and things that we haven't even imagined yet. There's a few characters who, in a way, they've come to the end of their story arc, but then there'll be some smaller characters who, as I've said earlier, they've sort of had to rise up now and then take the place of all these legends who have been lost. If anyone has any other questions they have for Warhammer lore, I'm absolutely happy to answer them. We can go through them. If it's like a big question or something that's quite broad and generic, just pop it in the comment section and we can go through it. Hopefully we'll answer some of your big questions, or even some misconceptions you have about Warhammer lore. It's often very hard to digest, as again, there's just so much 40k lore. That's why, thank God, there's so many people who make Warhammer lore videos, because again, it's such a big topic. But feel free to state them down below in the comment section, and if you made it this far, please do like and subscribe, and we'll get on to answering now a few of the reader and commenters questions. And the first question we have here is at Tristan Holt 9741. They ask, I have two things right up here on my list. Number one, who were the lost Primarchs and why were they removed from the record books? This is such a very big topic, and it's one of the greater mysteries of Warhammer. Me and Ed, who's Sandman of Terror, we actually did do a stream about this a while back. So if you wanted to explore every single avenue about the Lost Primarchs, you can go check that out. I'll link it below. There are many theories about the missing and lost Primarchs. Again, like, it's possible that some of them have been the Rangdan Xenocides, whereas other ones were taken out by Lehman Russ. I think that might have to be its own video in itself, because it's just such a there's too many possibilities for that one. But again, I'll link down below to the stream me and Sandman of Terror did, which was like a great big long stream about exploring every avenue and every single mention of the missing Primarchs there. Number 2 was, what did the Emperor tell Ra before sending him off? It's a great question, because this is from the Master of Mankind book, which is set during the Webway War as Magnus's folly. Magnus basically broke the psychic wards around Terra, and the Emperor essentially had to sit on the golden throne for most of the heresy, holding back the tides of demons trying to enter into the Imperial Palace. The Custodians themselves were fighting the war within this sort of Webway realm that's situated below Terra, or, in a sense, below Terra into another realm, really. And this essentially sort of destroyed the Custodians down from the 10,000s to the 1,000 hosts. They lost, so basically most of the Custodians fighting for this last piece. The Grand Emperor's dream was the Webway. Ra was one of the connections the Emperor's had to one of his Custodians. Ra was, throughout the books, sort of communicated with the Emperor. The Emperor shows him visions about the future, explains his powers to Ra. The Emperor didn't really give Ra any big message. The big thing with Ra's storyline, who was once a captured, son of a previous warlord of Terra, it was that Ra was shown the entire reason about why the Emperor started the Great Crusade, the entire reason for the Webway project itself. And throughout this book, he shows me everything. He shows how the Emperor committed his first murder, or he avenged his father's death. He showed him the entire story of the Master of Mankind. And when this demon was the great, the destroyer of, can't remember the exact name of the demon, it escapes my brain, but I was at the end of Empires, I believe the name of the demon is. The one who's intrinsically tied to humanity, the one that cannot be killed. He basically implants it within Ra and sends him off running into the Webway, just to keep running and never look back. And the Emperor doesn't really tell him anything, but he's shown him the entire reason about, essentially the entire fate of humanity relies upon Ra just running away and getting this demon out of here. Otherwise, because if the Emperor dies here, it's all over. The entire species is ruined. And so the Emperor doesn't really give him any big message other than, the entire reason about why you have to run. And that's the reason why Ra doesn't even look back for a second, even when, his Emperor, his essentially the big E stabbed him with this demon. He knows he just has to keep running. Of course, this is the demon that will eventually become the sword that Abaddon will wield later, and will basically have an entire Black Crusade to try and find this sword. But it was, Ra basically just learnt the truth of everything about him and Malcador, perhaps the only ones who ever knew this much, the extent of the Emperor's plans. And we have another one here from @username HRE. They ask, how does Abaddon get every Chaos faction to join his crusades? I know he pays homage to each and sets certain things in motion, and that they'll each get a kick out of it. But how does he appeal to the individual warbands that join him, / what kind of promises and subplots does he make to ensure their manpower? Also, how is the Imperium handling the added stress of the Cicatrix Maledictum, and what are the long-term implications of its existence, even if Guilliman and the Lion are among us? There's two questions here, but the first one, which is about Abaddon. Abaddon essentially, as the War Master of Chaos, there's a few ways he's managed to sort of bring together all these warbands. First one is mostly self-interest. Chaos wishes to ensue chaos. They wish to raid, punish, or enslave, or damage, or break the Imperium. And anything that allows them to do that in a better way, essentially, why not hop on board? Particularly as himself sort of inheriting this title of War Master, they're bringing a sort of level of, not really obedience, but definitely there's sort of a level of submission, which is the War Master is a sort of spear tip and the rest of them wish to sort of follow behind that. They know it's advantageous to join with Abaddon, though despite him not being a Primarch, Abaddon is able to get the blessings of all of the traitor Primarchs. This may be because the fact of, it's seen particularly with Fulgrim as well, when Fulgrim becomes a Primarch, they sort of lose interest in the material universe because they're sort of melded with the warp. Particularly with the traitor Primarch, for them as well, like time when one exists within the warp, it doesn't flow in the same way. Time can be like, for some Space Marines it can for 100 years, some of them it could be like 50,000 years that you couldn't really, they don't all feel the warp in the same way. So the things in these demon Primarchs that ties them to material universe, it sort of feels non-existent, and a lot of them are almost sort of using pawns in the great game, which is the wars between the Chaos factions and demons. So a lot of the time they sort of give, as much as Abaddon pays homage to these demon Primarchs, these creatures of nightmare, they almost don't really have much of an interest in the material universe. So he's able to sort of get a, oh, that sort of, you're going to go hurt the Imperium. What's the Imperium? Oh yeah, that thing? Yeah, sure, why not? Bring glory and dead and souls, whatever, and then he often himself offers them gifts and boons, as much as he probably doesn't really wish to. The war bands, particularly, it may be also that their gods essentially tell them to, Abaddon's doing our work, say yes. The demons and, the greater, demons themselves, the Chaos God could basically be saying, give him what he wants. As for things like war bands, again, a lot of them is advantageous. Some of them do generally believe in the grand plan of Abaddon, but I think most of them particularly are essentially united by the fact of, a lot of them do feel disenfranchised with their Primarchs. They don't actually feel like a connection. Like, a lot of them do join the Black Legion because they feel like homeless in a way. Like, they don't have a home in any other place. And even for some of them, like things like Renegade Legions or Renegade War Bands as well, some of them do join as well, but things like pirate fleets and other things like that, they're all looking as well for, the Imperium is like a great, there's a million worlds in the Imperium, so it's a great resource to sort of take away from, and why not operate within the grand fleet of the Black Legion to sort of get what you want. And as for Abaddon offering them power or any other things, I think Abaddon is mostly just seen as, I think it's even, as much as he brings together all these things, because he's a sort of figure where, a lot of them look up like, that's Abaddon, he was, the right hand of Horus and things like that. He is respected, but he's still, even in the great Night Lords trilogy books, he's seen as a sort of a sub, he's no Primarch, he's seen as like a subpart option. But they're, much like most of Chaos, it's all just worse over time. Everything breaks down in the end. And as for the second part of the question, which is how's the Imperium handling the added stress of the Cicatrix Maledictum, it's not. It's really not handling it very well. The Imperium is literally cut in two, apart from the little small area which is Vigilus, which is the last sort of small gap. Obviously Cadia was the Bastion world that's now was next to the Eye of Terror, and it's gone. And Vigilus is sort of this last sort of, which was where the Nachman Gauntlet is, the one place in the universe they're able to sort of crack through it. A part I love about one of the Mephiston books, it describes how when the Cicatrix Maledictum was born, there's literally is called a Great Scar. It's because entire worlds and sectors that this Great Scar cuts across, entire worlds, like billions of people just lost in the blink of an eye, like literally absorbed into the warp and just gone. So it's kind of permanently wounded the galaxy, like no matter what happens going forward. As for the longer term implications, travel within Imperium Nihilus, which is like coined the dark side of the galaxy, as it no longer has access to the Astronomicon, the Emperor's guiding light. The travel in these areas, particularly warp travel, is incredibly dangerous. Even the Blood Angels, who have like their Sanguinor, who's guiding their fleet, helping sort of illuminate in the darkness, still many of the ships get attacked. And there's even in the Dante and Mephiston book, Blood in the Darkness, I think it is, where literally like this fleet is guided by the Sanguinor, and still one of their ships just gets attacked, and the loads of navigators are extremely they're in a lot of danger, navigators particularly, so a lot of communication and travel is completely hampered in Imperium Nihilus. And essentially it almost describes like in Roman Empire, like East and West, when the Western Roman Empire kind of was like falling or failing in a way. Like you can imagine like this sort of like this collapse of civilization. Imperium Nihilus is sort of stabilized in pockets, but a lot of it is in desperate need of help, or as it will truly fall like sort of the Western Roman Empire. The last part of the question I do believe is, even if Guilliman and the Lion are amongst them, Guilliman has sort of stabilized Imperium Sanctus, I believe it's called, which is this side which still has the light of the Astronomicon, and has obviously made some headway into Imperium Nihilus, such as saving Baal, and now Dante having the great responsibility to sort of curb the Tyranid fleets that are running rampant in Imperium Nihilus. The Lion's sort of, as of recent Codex law, sort of making his own sort of pocket realms. He's making a sort of growing bastion area of security where the Imperium is like restabilizing, but Imperium Nihilus is in grave danger, and as it should be, because that makes it quite an interesting plot point. At Morphalau 2 asks, is Chaos Corruption something you choose for yourself, or is it more of a mind plague kind of thing? Because we have an example of Chaos needing to corrupt someone and make him fall, but also Angron destroy Mind Astronomicon, everyone gets Khorne Rage moment. Now, this is a great question, because Chaos Corruption is almost... the way to explain Chaos Corruption is that it very much acts like an infection, but it's almost like an infection you could wittingly infect yourself with. And the greatest example to show you how it changes, I will probably do a video covering, and sort of videos like this about how covering smaller examples of this and how each different god affects you with their corruption, because each of the mono gods, the 4 gods of chaos, their corruption is slightly different and infects you and treats you in different ways. But as for general chaos corruption, there's an example about how some Chaos Marines, once they were isolated from the touch of the war, and then they sort of realize what happens to their bodies, they actually sort of freak out. It was in the Lords of Silence book with Nurgle corruption. So it just it does show you that when it takes over your mind, you definitely sort of lose, like the original person that you were does sort of get twisted. It very much is like an illness in a way. I think it's often meant to sort of have those links to illness, where the person just sort of is in an altered state and you're not really like talking. So say if it was an example of Abaddon, just as example of Abaddon with or without chaos corruption is sort of a brute and a bit of a a sort of war dogs like figure, but Abaddon souped up with chaos is almost like a completely different thing, even though they may have very sort of similar ideologies. But it's particularly even more showing in other characters where it invades their, the chaos corruption invades their mind, and it sort of twists them into their, what would that then be, that sort of sympathetic to chaos, ruined, worse version of themselves sort of being. And yeah, it is something you can obviously, as it does, as stated in the question, there is an aspect of mind play to it, particularly of people who are weaker minds, but it definitely plays on the fact that the way it gets into a lot of people, particularly in God, it's a great example in the Godblight, in this Dark Imperium books, about how it can start off as something good, and it will twist genuinely good things. So you may have the idea was guardsmen saying, we want to rebel against the Imperium because we want more rations, and we want more time off and things like that. But then the rebellion itself starts to hear whispers from things, and then they start to get you know, powers and instruction. Then, you know what I mean? It started off as a good thing, and that good thing in the warp was then sort of pressed upon and then ruined and then twisted. So it can invade your mind, but also there are people like Erebus. Everybody, I feel so sorry for mentioning his name. So, you know, everyone, we all hate Erebus. Erebus himself can be someone who's like willingly sort of in the ideology of chaos corruption. So he fully, you know, he was sort of indoctrinated into it from a standpoint of, you know, as a theologian. So he believes in the, you know, much like Lorgar, the primordial truth. And so they're people who, even if they weren't tainted by the warp, they actually are sort of corrupted by chaos in a sort of way, because they sort of lead by its example, even if a warp taint isn't necessarily there. But I will go into a video to explain how particularly some of the gods' corruptions are slightly different. They do affect people in different ways. Obviously, if you're 1,000 Suns, or like, you know, anything Tzeentchian, you're basically going to turn into a chaos spawn. That just seems to happen spontaneously. But also there's a great point about, you know, the Angron destroying the mini Astronomicon in the Angron book that was out not that long ago, which was, it can sort of spread like a sort of very like command and a completely overwhelming wave thing where like it just forces itself upon you if it's that strong. But it could also be very subtle. With that being said though, hopefully that's everyone's questions for this time answered though. Again, if you have any more questions or topics you want me to cover, again, niche or like really just broad, absolutely go for it. I've been Hal the Amber King. If you've made it this far, please do like and subscribe, it really helps. And we'll catch you in the next one. Peace.